Good morning. How's everyone doing?
Great.
Good. Let me start with a question. How many people were here 2 years ago for the grassroots advocacy training? Raise your hand. A handful. Okay. How many were here last year for it? Okay. And how many is it your first time here for the grassroots advocacy training? Wow. Okay. Excellent. So I can recycle my jokes from last year, and they'll be new to most of you. That's excellent. What I said last year, in all seriousness, and I'll say again this year, is that it's so important what you're doing tomorrow on Capitol Hill. Let me tell you, the fact that we have organizations like the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, like Interfaith Peace-Builders, like the other national organizations that are part of our coalition are very important. But to be quite honest, when we send out a press release or we send out our talking points to Capitol Hill, members of Congress and their staff are only really interested in what we have to say to the extent that we can prove that we have grassroots supporters behind us who believe in what we're doing. So the fact that you are going up to Capitol Hill tomorrow to bring these concerns directly to your members of Congress is much, much more important and effective than anything that we can do from our office. So thank you for doing that. What I'm going to do is introduce briefly some of the policy issues that we are asking you to bring to the attention of your members of Congress tomorrow. So if you open up your packets and take a look at the right-hand side, you'll see a two-page sheet called Talking Points and Asks. This is the material that we're going to be covering in this session along the right-hand side of your packet. So it's the Ask, Condition Military Aid to Israel. Ask, please do not sign letter in support of more military aid to Israel. Ask, investigate the use of U.S.-supplied tear gas. Ask, investigate illegal Israeli settlement funding, which I'm hoping that Abed will address. And then there are also going to be in the congressional packets that you give to the members of Congress and the staffers an invitation to the briefing that we'll be doing on Tuesday, which Miriam will come up and talk about. So I'm not going to read word for word the talking points and asks because you all have probably taken a look at them already and have a sense of the issues that we'd like to raise tomorrow in your meetings with members of Congress, but I will go over them briefly and then open it up for questions to people who might want to have a more refined or detailed question about the things that they should be bringing up with their members of Congress. So number one, and I think perhaps, no, by far most importantly, we want you to address the issue of ongoing and increasing U.S. military aid to Israel. A few weeks ago, on Valentine's Day, and some of you may have seen our very snarky Valentine's Day message that we put out that said President Obama is showing Israel way too much love on Valentine's Day, because on Valentine's Day, he delivered his 2012 budget request to Congress, which contains a record-breaking $3.075 billion in military aid to Israel. Now, keep in mind that this year is a very, very unusual year from the perspective of the budget process. Normally, by now, the current year budget for the year that we're in has been long passed. It should have been passed last fall. It hasn't been passed, and if you all have been following the ongoing drama around the budget and the potential government shutdown, you know that things are a bit unusual this year, to say the least. So while we go up there to advocate against military aid to Israel in the 2012 budget that President Obama just released, we should also keep in mind that the 2011 budget has not yet passed Congress. And in that budget, you have a $3 billion even appropriation for military aid to Israel. So you can make sure to address both of these budget appropriations for Israel. And what we'd like you to do, especially if you have computer access tonight, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit later in the presentation, is to go to our website, aidtoisrael.org, which we reference here. And this is really crucial. As Nadia mentioned this morning, it's so crucial to link issues and to present a budget as a moral document of what our priorities are as a country, and to show that there are financial costs involved in providing this military aid to Israel in terms of what else we're not funding. So on this aidtoisrael.org map, you can look by state, by congressional district, by county, and by city to see how much your community is providing in military aid to Israel over the course of 10 years, and what that money could provide instead for your community in terms of affordable housing grants, in terms of healthcare access for people without insurance, in terms of green jobs retraining, and in terms of early education programs for our children. These are very real trade-offs that members of Congress should be aware of, that this is not a cost-free appropriation, that it comes at a price, obviously a moral price, which we should definitely emphasize and which I'll cover in just a minute, but it also comes at a financial price that we can no longer afford. So please do take a look at that website, aidtoisrael.org. Figure out the numbers for your community, and we'll demonstrate how you do that in just a moment. When we address this issue, it's also very important to discuss the fact that we cannot afford the moral cost of U.S. military aid to Israel as well. According to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, since September 2000, the outbreak of the Second Intifada against Israeli military occupation, Israel has killed more than 3,000 unarmed Palestinian civilians who took absolutely no part in hostilities. And as Nadia mentioned this morning, all we're asking our members of Congress to do is to apply the law that's on the books. And the law on the books is the Arms Export Control Act. And for those of you, the Arms Export Control Act is quite clear that countries receiving or purchasing U.S. weapons can use them for one of only two purposes: internal security and legitimate self-defense. So when Israel uses these weapons in pursuit of its illegal military occupation of Palestinian territories and to commit blatant human rights violations and violations of international law that target Palestinian civilians, this law is being violated. So we're just asking members of Congress to apply the own laws that they themselves have passed. Now, what we have is a series of proposed amendments that we would like you to bring to the attention of members of Congress and ask them to sponsor in the course of the ongoing budget processes. And this is the Conditioned Military Aid to Israel memo that you have in your packet. Now let me be very, very clear on one thing. The U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation believes that U.S. military aid to Israel should be ended, period, full stop. That's our position. That's what we organize around, and that's what we believe in. But we are not nearly strong enough or well advanced enough in this campaign to bring this as our sole ask to our members of Congress. So what we've said in this memo is that, yes, we believe in ending military aid to Israel, and in the interim, before we're able to achieve that, here are some things that we can do short of that ultimate goal that will nevertheless have very real ramifications that are positive for our country's policies towards Israel and the Palestinian people. And these would be different budgetary amendments to condition or restrict military aid to Israel, which is something that is still difficult for members of Congress to talk about, but it's something a little bit more palatable for them to understand and to listen to rather than a blanket demand for ending aid to Israel. So we have a few different budget amendments in this memo, and I'll just go over them briefly. You can read it in detail. It's not important that you memorize every word. You just have to hand this memo to the members of Congress that you're meeting with and their staff and say, we'd like you to introduce these budget amendments during the budget process. Number one would be to restrict Israel's use of U.S. weapons to within its own sovereign territory, which, of course, if that were a functioning condition, would mean that Israel cannot use these weapons in the occupied Palestinian territories, thereby preventing many, many human rights abuses from taking place. And indeed, there is precedent for the United States restricting U.S. aid to Israel to within its sovereign territory. And that comes within the Loan Guarantee Program, which says very clearly that Israel can't use loan guarantee money for settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. So basically what we've done is we've taken this exact same authorizing language for the Loan Guarantee Program and said, why don't you also apply this to how Israel can or cannot use military aid? That is number 2A1, restricting U.S. weapons to Israel's sovereign territory. Number two, there needs to be accountability for previous violations of human rights and international law committed with U.S. weapons. As I mentioned before, more than 3,000 unarmed Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel, most of the time with U.S. weapons. And since September 2000, there has not been one report by the State Department to notify members of Congress that, yes, indeed, this law has been violated, and that, yes, indeed, sanctions do need to be placed on Israel for violating this law. Not one. So there's been absolutely no accountability for how Israel is misusing U.S. weapons against the Palestinians. So we have suggested budget language to ensure that a transparent investigation is done prior to any other weapons being dispersed to Israel. B, promoting a freeze on the expansion of Israeli settlements. This may be the most easy sell to members of Congress because, as Nadia mentioned, it is official U.S. State Department policy that Israel settlements are inconsistent with international law. And of course, we've all been following the news of the previous 2 years of the Obama administration's efforts to try to get Israel to freeze settlement construction, of course, not convincingly and not successfully. But the fact is that there is broad agreement on Capitol Hill that Israeli settlements should not be expanded at this time. So what we're suggesting is that members of Congress should put their money where their mouth is and say that Israel doesn't get any more military aid until there's a verifiable freeze on settlement activity. C, and I hope that this one doesn't get lost track of, and I don't want the issue of the blockade of Gaza Strip to get lost in this advocacy day because it's just as important as ever for us to be advocating for an end to Israel's illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip. But here again, you know, we can use the president's own language in pursuit of our own policy goals. The second day of his term in office, he went to the State Department to appoint George Mitchell his special advisor for the Middle East. And at that briefing, he declared that Gaza's border crossings should be open to allow the flow of aid and commerce. Now, he didn't exactly say that the blockade should be ended, but that was more or less what he implied with those statements. So again, we're asking members of Congress to issue an amendment to the budget that would make sure that Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip is ended before any weapons are dispersed, and that there's a verifiable mechanism for ensuring that the blockade is not reimposed in the future. So these are some of the ways in which we are asking members of Congress to begin to think about conditions and restrictions on military aid to Israel. And now a lot of members of Congress might try to get out of having anything to do with the budget. And they might say to you, well, we're not on the Appropriations Committee that deals with the budget. And they're probably right. There are actually only a few members of Congress who are on the relevant subcommittees. But unlike previous years, the Republicans in the House have actually opened up the budget process this year. And actually, Representative Ron Paul a few weeks ago offered an amendment to the 2011 budget, the one that's not completed yet and that's way late, that would have ended all U.S. military aid programs, including to Israel. Now, this was unprecedented because usually the budget process is very, very controlled and you can't offer these kind of amendments on the floor. But the Republicans, to their credit, I think, have actually opened up the process so that any member of Congress now can offer these kind of specific amendments to the budget. So don't let them get out of what they can actually do by saying that they're not on the right committee. Yes, they can do it, and yes, they should do it, and don't let them give that to you as an excuse. So that's some of the general amendments that we're asking you to raise with your members of Congress in this meeting about military aid. But what I want to do is bring it down to a very specific level with some specific asks in regard to military aid to Israel. And we'll take questions. I see hands, but we'll take them at the end. Number one, some of you may have heard of an organization called J Street. J Street had a similar lobbying conference last week, and I was very displeased to know that they decided to go up to Capitol Hill and lobby in favor of this letter that you have in your packets, which is called "Please Do Not Sign the Letter in Support of More Military Aid to Israel." They were on Capitol Hill lobbying in favor of more military aid to Israel, as you can see from this Dear Colleague letter from Representative Schakowsky and Representative Ayoub. This Dear Colleague letter is being held open for signatures. And by the way, when I say Dear Colleague letters, are people familiar with that terminology? Is that new? Dear Colleague just basically means members of Congress always send around these letters that always start off, Dear Colleague, we want you to do X, Y, Z. So they're known as Dear Colleague letters, and this is one of them. And so we want you to go and to ask your congressional offices, number one, have you signed on to this Dear Colleague letter? If they have, ask them to take their signature off for the reasons that we've already talked about, how U.S. military aid to Israel violates U.S. law by Israel committing these gross human rights violations against Palestinians. If they have signed it, ask them to remove their name. If they haven't signed them, ask them not to sign it and make sure they don't sign it. It's going to be held open for signatures throughout this next week, so it's actually a perfect time for us to be going up and talking to them about this letter. And the letter itself is pretty straightforward. It says we want $3.075 billion in military aid to Israel. Number two, we want to be proactive as well and not just criticize existing legislative efforts and initiatives that are out there. So what we want to do is take this broad issue of challenging military aid to Israel kind of on the macro level and bring it down to the micro level and to discuss specific instances and specific weapon systems of how Israel is misusing these U.S. weapons. And what we'd like you to do is give to your congressional offices this draft Dear Colleague letter, which says, investigate the use of U.S.-supplied tear gas, which is a Dear Colleague letter to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And basically what it would do is that if a member of Congress, and actually we only need one member of Congress to agree to send this letter to her to make this happen, but what would happen if we do get this letter sent is that the State Department would be required by law to initiate an investigation into whether Israel has violated the Arms Export Control Act through its misuse of tear gas in the occupied West Bank in East Jerusalem. And if they do, and if they report that yes, indeed, Israel has misused these weapons, then Congress would be obligated by law to place sanctions on Israel for misusing the weapon. So it might seem very micro, it might seem very limited, but in fact, it's a way of us getting our foot in the door and really trying to bring in this issue of challenging military aid to Israel that could result in something that's very, very substantive and important for us. So basically, this letter details all the cases that we know of where Israel has targeted both Palestinian and U.S. citizens with these deadly high-velocity tear gas canisters, and you can read in this letter all of the very sad stories of the injuries and killings of civilians with these weapons. So at this point, I think I'm going to stop and turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Abed Ayoub, from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and he's going to walk you through our congressional ask around challenging 501c3 funding for Israeli settlements. Abed.
Thank you, Josh. And one of the asks in here is to ask our congressional members to submit a letter to the Inspector General of the IRS to investigate illegal Israeli settlement funding. We have heard about the military aid, and this is it's definitely a core issue. But the settlement funding, the more and more work we're doing, the more and more we're realizing there's a lot of money coming from the U.S. Through legal channels, quote unquote, to help fund settlements. Over the course of the past year, or almost 2 years now, we've been looking into a number of settlements. We filed nearly over 60 complaints against organizations who have 501c3 American organizations set up here in the U.S., fundraising for, it could be educational purposes, it could be social services, but at the end of the day, there's a whole slew of problems on where that money is going and what it's being used for. And one idea we came up with, and one way to approach this, is not to approach this as a foreign policy issue, but to approach this also as a domestic policy issue. And the main question we want to know, and the main question is, how much lost tax revenue are we losing by these organizations getting, tax breaks and C3 statuses when they're sending their money overseas? So if I'm making a $1,000 contribution to ADC, well, that's a write-off from my income. So that's a little bit less taxes I'm paying. You multiply this by millions, it definitely adds up. Many of these organizations, we're not talking here $200,000 or $300,000 budgets. These are in the tens of millions of dollars that they're using. And the key problem is definitely the deceptive fundraising. They're saying they're sending money to be used for schools, but it's buying military equipment. It's buying tanks or Humvees or machine gun stands, which we've seen. And the whole discriminatory aspect of it, in that even if they do open a school, it can't be used by Palestinian children. So that again is against C3 law here in the U.S. So we, Josh and I went back and forth, and we talked. He mentioned dear colleague letter earlier. The difference between this letter here, we want this to come from the individual member, not a dear colleague letter. Reason being, if we go through the dear colleague letter route, it becomes a big public issue. And one experience we've had is when we did start working on this issue, we kind of made it public in a way. We released a name or two of the organizations we were investigating, and within a matter of 2 days, they had everything down from their website. So we don't want to give anybody an opportunity to come back and say, debate us on this back and forth. So we're trying to keep this very stealth and have our members, write their letters. And you'll see in here a sample of the letter we want them to submit. Now, again, when we're in there, it's important to try to keep this in a domestic approach. And this is what we've seen work. And this is what's going to get the Republican congressional members to sign this. We've had experience, and we've had very good feedback. The economy, the money is a big issue. So the letter, if you see this, it touches upon the illegal activities, the illegal takeovers of the Palestinian land, but at the same time also touches on there is lost tax revenue. There are violations of C3 law, and at the same time, they've gone after Arab and Muslim organizations in the past for violating C3 laws. So we kind of use the same tactics to say, hey, if you could do this to us, why is this group being able to send money overseas and buy a Humvee or buy machine gun stands, and they're saying they're funding for education? There is a workshop after this. We'll get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts on how these complaints are filed, what we're asking from them. The Inspector General of the IRS and of the Treasury Departments have said they will investigate these complaints. We have heard that there's been a formation of a division within the Treasury Department and within IRS to look at Israeli C3s that are sending money overseas. So that's something that the Israeli community has countered with a lawsuit against the Treasury Department. So we'll see which way that heads. But it's definitely an issue. It's definitely growing. And we do see a good opportunity here that if these letters are submitted by a number of members, the Treasury Department will audit these organizations. The IRS will audit these organizations. And it's through that audit we'll learn the numbers, we'll learn how much money is being sent, we'll learn how much lost tax revenue there is, and try to get the next step would be try to get maybe a regulation or something along the line within a year or so, completely stopping the funding of illegal settlements and stop taking away these C3 statuses. So I think that's it in a nutshell. Again, the workshop will answer a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of this thing. Thank you.